Brian, thank you very much. It should be a busy time right now for Lake Powell, as peak visitation is normally right now through Labor Day. But as Samantha Hoffman reports, some business and visitors are seeing the low water levels threaten the turnout.
If you've ever looked at a postcard of Lake Powell, you've probably admired the impossible shade of blue stretching between towering walls of red sandstone. It almost looks unreal, as though someone painted the water by hand. Houseboats drift quietly through narrow canyons. Families laugh as they dive from the back decks into water that seems to fall endlessly beneath them, cool enough to escape the relentless desert heat above. For millions of visitors, this is the image of Lake Powell they remember. A place of adventure, a place of peace, a place where summer memories are made. Before we uncover this incredible discovery, make sure to subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir in the United States by capacity. It stretches for nearly 200 miles through the desert, transforming what was once a maze of sandstone canyons into one of America's most famous recreational destinations. Every year, its photographs appear on travel brochures, tourism websites, and postcards, presenting it as one of the great wonders of the American Southwest. But those photographs leave something out. They never tell you that the beauty you're floating across is actually covering something else, something hidden, something that was never meant to be seen again. As the water level began falling, dropping farther and faster than the engineers who built this reservoir ever imagined possible, something unexpected started emerging from beneath the surface. It wasn't the wreck of an old boat. It wasn't some forgotten treasure or a local legend whispered among marina workers after sunset. It was something far older than any of those stories. Something silent. Something that had been deliberately buried beneath hundreds of feet of water more than 60 years ago because a handful of people decided the rest of the world would simply have to forget it. And before we go any further, I want you to hold on to one thought. Once you understand what is rising out of Lake Powell, you will never look at those beautiful photographs the same way again. The postcards will never feel quite as peaceful. The endless blue water will never seem quite so innocent. Because once you know what's lying beneath it, you can't unknow it. So let me take you there. Not all at once. Stories like this don't reveal themselves in a single moment. Instead, they unfold layer by layer, just as the lake itself has been peeling back layer after layer over the past 2 decades. Every few feet of falling water reveals another forgotten chapter. Every exposed shoreline uncovers another piece of a world that disappeared long before most people even knew it existed. Stay with me until the end, because the deepest part of this story isn't at the surface. It's waiting at the bottom. And that's the part very few people are talking about. To understand what's coming back, we first have to understand what was buried. That story begins in 1963, when one of the largest engineering projects in American history reached its conclusion. Rising 710 feet above the Colorado River, a massive wall of concrete was locked into a narrow gap between the sandstone cliffs along the Utah-Arizona border. Its name was Glen Canyon Dam. For millions of years, the Colorado River had carved its way through these rocks, slowly sculpting one of the most spectacular canyon systems on Earth. It never stopped. It never hurried. Patiently, year after year, century after century, the river shaped every curve, every alcove, every hidden canyon, and every sandstone cathedral along its path. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. When the final gates of Glen Canyon Dam closed, the Colorado River could no longer continue its journey. Water has only one answer when you stop its path. It rises, slowly at first, then relentlessly. Month after month, the river backed into the canyon. The water climbed higher, filling narrow passageways, hidden chambers, ancient side canyons, and quiet sandstone alcoves where sunlight had fallen in exactly the same way for thousands of years. Places that had echoed with flowing water for centuries slowly disappeared beneath an expanding reservoir. By the time the flooding was complete, Lake Powell had become the second largest reservoir in the United States, capable of storing nearly 26 million acre-feet of water. The reservoir stretched almost 200 miles upstream, supplying drinking water, hydroelectric power, irrigation, and economic stability to more than 40 million people throughout the American Southwest. That is the version of Lake Powell most people know. It's the version taught in textbooks, the version celebrated in engineering history, the version printed on every brochure. But that isn't the whole story. Because the story you're about to hear exists in the difference between what Lake Powell was designed to be and what it has become. For decades, the reservoir appeared unstoppable. In 1999, Lake Powell was almost completely full. The water surface rested close to its designed elevation of 3,700 feet above sea level. Houseboats floated across endless blue water. The hydroelectric turbines inside Glen Canyon Dam generated electricity around the clock. Few people standing on the overlook that year could have imagined the lake ever becoming anything else. If someone had suggested that within a generation the reservoir would lose nearly 1/3 of its water, they probably would have laughed. But rivers don't negotiate with expectations. By April 2023, Lake Powell had fallen to approximately 3,520 feet above sea level. That may sound like just another statistic. It isn't. It represents roughly 180 vertical feet of water that no longer exists. Imagine standing at the edge of one of Lake Powell's sandstone cliffs and looking upward nearly 18 stories to the pale white stain etched across the canyon walls. That bright mineral stripe, known as the bathtub ring, marks where the lake once stood. Everything between that white line and today's shoreline used to be underwater. That's how much of the canyon has returned. That's how far the lid has been lifted. And that leads us to one of the most frightening numbers in the entire American water system. At an elevation of around 3,520 feet, Lake Powell was only about 30 feet above a threshold that engineers have a chilling name for: dead pool. Below approximately 3,490 feet, there is no longer enough water pressure behind Glen Canyon Dam to push water through its outlet works. The Colorado River cannot move through the dam the way it was designed to. Hydroelectric turbines stop generating electricity. Water deliveries become impossible. A structure built to control one of America's most important rivers loses the very function it was created to perform. 30 feet. That's all that separated one of the largest reservoirs in the United States from becoming little more than a massive concrete wall standing in the middle of a canyon. And that's where the real story begins. Now, when most people hear those numbers, the falling water levels, the shrinking shoreline, the warnings about drought, they immediately think the story is about what America is losing. They picture empty marinas, cracked mudflats, stranded houseboats, and cities running out of water. That's the obvious tragedy. That's the version that makes the headlines every summer. Every news report focuses on the reservoir getting smaller, the bathtub ring climbing higher up the sandstone walls, and the fear that one day there simply won't be enough water left. And while that fear is completely real, it isn't the story that has kept historians, archaeologists, and river explorers awake at night. Because the strangest part of Lake Powell isn't what is disappearing, it's what is slowly returning. Every single foot that the reservoir drops uncovers another piece of a world that has been hidden since the early 1960s. Every few inches of falling water reveal another stretch of canyon wall that sunlight hasn't touched in decades. Ancient beaches emerge where waves once lapped against sandstone cliffs. Forgotten river channels begin carving through the mud again. Long submerged springs start flowing once more. Cottonwood trees that had been drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water are found standing like ghostly skeletons in the mud, exactly where they died more than half a century ago. The canyon doesn't simply reappear, it awakens. Layer by layer, season after season, it begins revealing everything that was sealed beneath the reservoir when Glen Canyon Dam closed its gates in 1963. It returns, carrying the marks of 60 years underwater, preserving stories that were never supposed to be told again. And that's why understanding what is happening today requires looking backward instead of forward. You have to forget, for a moment, everything you've ever associated with Lake Powell. Forget the marinas, the houseboats, the campgrounds, the maps showing blue water winding through the desert. Because for almost the entire history of humanity, none of that existed. Before there was a reservoir, before there was a dam, before engineers redrew the landscape of the American Southwest, there was only Glen Canyon, a place so extraordinary that many of the people fortunate enough to experience it spent the rest of their lives trying to convince others that no photograph could ever capture what they had seen. Most Americans never knew that world existed. They assume Lake Powell has always been part of the landscape, just another natural lake tucked between the cliffs of Utah and Arizona. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Until the middle of the 20th century, the Colorado River flowed freely through Glen Canyon exactly as it had for thousands of years. The canyon wasn't famous because almost nobody could reach it. Unlike the Grand Canyon, which offered dramatic overlooks and railroad access, Glen Canyon hid itself behind hundreds of miles of twisting sandstone corridors. Reaching it required days of travel by small wooden boats, inflatable rafts, or long expeditions through some of the most isolated country in the American West. Those who made the journey often described it as entering another world, one untouched by roads, cities, or modern civilization. Imagine drifting quietly downstream with nothing but the sound of moving water echoing against the canyon walls. Around every bend, the landscape changed. One moment, the river flowed between towering cliffs, glowing orange beneath the afternoon sun. The next, a narrow crack appeared in the sandstone, barely wide enough for a boat to enter. Curious explorers would guide their boats into these openings, not knowing what waited beyond the shadows. They would paddle deeper and deeper as the sunlight faded behind them, the air growing noticeably cooler with every turn. Then, without warning, the canyon would open into enormous hidden chambers carved entirely by water over thousands of years. Massive sandstone walls curved overhead, like the vaulted ceilings of ancient cathedrals, while beams of sunlight filtered down through impossibly narrow openings high above, illuminating pools of emerald green water below. People struggled to describe these places because ordinary language simply wasn't enough. They weren't caves because they were open to the sky. They weren't waterfalls because they felt like temples. They weren't canyons because they inspired something far beyond geology. Again and again, explorers, river guides, photographers, and early archaeologists reached for the same comparison. They called them cathedrals. Not because anyone told them to, but because it was the only word that seemed capable of describing the overwhelming silence and scale surrounding them. Standing inside one of those chambers felt less like visiting a landscape and more like stepping into a sacred place that nature had spent thousands of years building in complete secrecy. Among all those hidden sanctuaries, one location achieved almost mythical status. Hidden deep inside Clear Creek Canyon, far from the main channel of the Colorado River, lay a place that river runners whispered about with genuine reverence. They called it the Cathedral in the Desert. Even among people who knew Glen Canyon intimately, this chamber stood apart. Veteran guides would bring first-time visitors there only after hours of navigating narrow waterways, almost as if they were introducing someone to a closely guarded secret. They spoke more quietly as they approached, allowing the silence of the canyon to become part of the experience itself. The journey into Cathedral in the Desert was unlike anything else in the Southwest. After leaving the main river, visitors followed a winding stream through a sandstone corridor that grew narrower with every passing minute. Towering walls leaned inward until only a thin ribbon of blue sky remained overhead. Then, almost without warning, the canyon exploded open into an immense natural amphitheater. Geological studies suggest that countless centuries of flowing water carved this chamber from Navajo sandstone, slowly sculpting smooth curves and towering walls streaked with layers of crimson, rust, amber, and deep maroon. At the far end of the chamber, a waterfall poured from high above, spilling into a crystal-clear pool whose surface reflected the surrounding cliffs like polished glass. Yet everyone who visited remembered something even more remarkable than its beauty: the sound. People spoke about the acoustics with almost religious awe. A normal conversation didn't stay where it was spoken. Every word drifted through the chamber, bounced gently from one sandstone wall to another, softened by distance, and returned from every direction at once. It wasn't an echo in the ordinary sense. It felt as though the canyon itself was answering back. Visitors often found themselves whispering without realizing it, instinctively lowering their voices inside a place that seemed designed for silence. Very few people on Earth were fortunate enough to witness it. Before the 1950s, only a handful of explorers, surveyors, photographers, archaeologists, and adventurous river runners had ever stood inside Cathedral in the Desert. Even by modern standards, it remained one of the least visited natural wonders in North America. Then, in the early 1960s, everything changed. As Lake Powell rose behind the newly completed Glen Canyon Dam, the water climbed steadily into Clear Creek Canyon. Month after month, it swallowed the waterfall, the emerald pool, the sandstone walls, and finally, the cathedral itself. Within only a few years, one of the most extraordinary natural chambers ever discovered disappeared beneath nearly 300 feet of cold green reservoir water. Fish swam through a place where voices had once echoed like music, and an entire generation grew up never knowing it had existed at all. That raises a question that still troubles historians today. How does a landscape that extraordinary simply vanish? How does one of the greatest natural wonders in the American Southwest disappear beneath a reservoir while almost nobody outside a small circle of explorers even notices? The answer isn't geology, it isn't engineering, it's politics, and it may be one of the most consequential compromises ever made in the history of American conservation. The disappearance of Glen Canyon wasn't an accident. It wasn't the unavoidable price of progress. It was the result of a deliberate decision reached during one of the biggest environmental battles of the 20th century. During the early 1950s, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation proposed constructing a massive hydroelectric dam inside Echo Park, located within Dinosaur National Monument. Conservation organizations across the country immediately recognized the danger. Leading the opposition was David Brower, the executive director of the Sierra Club, whose passionate campaign transformed environmental activism in America. Through public hearings, newspaper campaigns, books, photographs, and congressional testimony, Brower and thousands of supporters successfully convinced lawmakers to abandon the Echo Park project. It became one of the greatest victories in conservation history. But victories often carry hidden costs. To save Echo Park, government officials demanded another location where the dam could still be built. Maps were spread across conference tables. Engineers searched for another canyon capable of storing enormous amounts of water. Eventually, their attention settled on Glen Canyon. Unlike Echo Park, Glen Canyon wasn't protected as a national monument. It had no national reputation, almost no visitors, and virtually no political support. To officials in distant offices, it appeared to be empty desert. They believed sacrificing it would satisfy everyone. They were catastrophically wrong. The tragedy is that many of the people making that decision had never actually visited Glen Canyon themselves. They exchanged one of the richest archaeological and geological landscapes in North America for a place they believed the public would never miss, simply because the public had never been given the opportunity to know it existed. No one understood that mistake more painfully than David Brower himself. Before construction was completed, Brower finally traveled through Glen Canyon to see the place he had unknowingly agreed to sacrifice. The experience haunted him for the rest of his life. Years later, he repeatedly described allowing Glen Canyon to be flooded as the greatest mistake of his entire career. He had saved one magnificent canyon only to lose another that, in his own words, proved even more beautiful than anyone had imagined. It became a lesson that shaped environmental policy for generations, a reminder that people cannot defend places they have never been allowed to see. Realizing the canyon was about to disappear forever, photographer Elliot Porter launched one final effort to preserve it the only way he could. During the final years before the flooding, Porter traveled throughout Glen Canyon carrying his camera into places few people had ever visited. Instead of photographing sweeping landscapes alone, he focused on the intimate details that gave the canyon its soul. Sunlight shimmering across wet sandstone after a summer rain. Tiny ferns growing from hidden springs inside shaded alcoves. Reflections dancing across emerald pools. Ancient cottonwood trees leaning over quiet stretches of the Colorado River. His photographs captured not just the appearance of Glen Canyon, but its atmosphere, its silence, its mystery, and its impossible beauty. In 1963, as the reservoir began filling, the Sierra Club published Porter's photographs in a book titled The Place No One Knew. It remains one of the most heartbreaking titles ever given to a photography collection. The words carried a painful truth. By the time readers opened the book, the place inside its pages was already disappearing beneath the rising waters of Lake Powell. Every photograph became more than a landscape. It became evidence, a final record of a world slipping beyond human reach. For decades afterward, that book served as the only window into a canyon that no longer existed, allowing generations who had never seen Glen Canyon to mourn a place they discovered only after it was gone. Yet even those haunting photographs preserved only part of what was about to disappear beneath the reservoir. But Glen Canyon was far more than a masterpiece of sandstone and flowing water. Long before explorers named its canyons, long before photographers carried cameras into its hidden chambers, and thousands of years before engineers imagined placing a dam across the Colorado River, people were already living there. They weren't simply passing through. They built homes, raised families, planted crops, hunted game, traded with neighboring communities, and slowly turned the canyon into one of the richest cultural landscapes in the American Southwest. Today, archaeologists recognize Glen Canyon as one of the region's most significant archaeological treasures, containing evidence of human occupation stretching back more than 1,000 years. Yet for decades, much of that history remained hidden beneath the waters of Lake Powell. Every bend of the canyon seemed to preserve another chapter of that story. High inside sandstone alcoves where rain could never reach stood carefully constructed cliff dwellings built by the ancestral Puebloan people between approximately AD 900 and 1300. Nearby, stone granaries still clung to the cliffs, their walls carefully mortared together to protect precious stores of corn, beans, squash, and seeds through harsh desert winters. In other places, archaeologists found petroglyphs pecked into the sandstone and pictographs painted with natural mineral pigments, centuries before Europeans ever crossed the Atlantic. Spirals, bighorn sheep, hunters carrying bows, mysterious geometric symbols, and handprints still marked the canyon walls exactly where their creators had left them. Ancient trails wound along the cliffs, connecting villages that had once overlooked a free-flowing Colorado River. Pottery fragments lay scattered beneath shallow overhangs. Stone tools rested undisturbed beneath layers of desert sand. Every side canyon seemed to hold another discovery waiting to be documented. By the early 1950s, archaeologists had begun to realize just how extraordinary Glen Canyon really was. Researchers from institutions including the University of Utah, the Museum of Northern Arizona, and the National Park Service conducted surveys throughout the canyon, and each new expedition revealed dozens of previously unknown archaeological sites. By the time construction of Glen Canyon Dam was nearing completion, hundreds of cultural sites had already been recorded, and experts believed many hundreds more remained hidden inside canyons that no scientific team had yet explored. The deeper researchers traveled into the canyon, the more they understood they were looking at an almost continuous record of human life spanning centuries. Then time ran out. As construction on Glen Canyon Dam accelerated during the late 1950s,